Hey guys, tonight let's travel backward to a time when entertainment did not mean opening a streaming app, scrolling through hundreds of videos, or spending 20 minutes deciding what to watch before watching absolutely nothing. Tonight, there are no glowing screens, no headphones, no television in the background, and for most people we are going to meet, no bookshelf either. So dim the lights a little, get comfortable, and let yourself drift back into a world where the evening could feel very, very long. Because for much of human history, books were rare, expensive, and usually not something you casually picked up at the end of the day. And yet, people still had to entertain themselves. They had to laugh. They had to gossip. They had to tell stories. They had to play games. They had to watch other people make questionable decisions in public. In other words, human beings were basically the same as they are now. We just had fewer screens and considerably more chickens wandering around. When we say that books were not common, we need to be a little careful. People had stories long before they had widely available books. They simply carried those stories in their memories. For thousands of years, storytelling was one of humanity's main forms of entertainment. A person might sit beside a fire and listen to an older relative tell a story about a legendary ancestor. Or a traveler might arrive in a village and bring news from somewhere far away. Or perhaps someone knew a local tale about a clever fox, a foolish king, a mysterious spirit, or a hero who had apparently been much more impressive than anyone could realistically have been. The storyteller did not need a printed script. The audience did not need a copy. The story simply lived in people's heads. And this was important because memory was doing a job that books would eventually take over. Stories were remembered, repeated, altered, shortened, expanded, and occasionally improved by people who were probably not historians, which is how you eventually get legends. One generation tells the story. The next generation changes a few details. The third generation adds something interesting, and several hundred years later, everyone is confidently discussing a person who may or may not have done half the things attributed to them. Humanity's earliest entertainment system was basically word of mouth. And honestly, it was remarkably efficient. You needed no paper, no ink, no printing press, just one person who knew a good story, and preferably a few people willing to listen. Of course, stories were not the only entertainment. There were games. People have been playing games for an extraordinarily long time. Ancient Egyptians played board games. One of the most famous was Senet, a game involving a board with 30 squares. We do not know every rule with complete certainty, which is slightly unfortunate, because thousands of years later, we would very much like to know what everyone was doing with those little pieces. But archaeological evidence shows that Senet was played for centuries. It appears in tomb paintings. Board games have been discovered in burials. Even some royal tombs contained them, which means that when someone imagines ancient Egypt as a place where everybody spent the entire day building monuments and looking extremely serious, we should probably make room for the possibility that somebody was also sitting around playing a board game, because even pharaohs presumably needed a break. And board games were not restricted to Egypt. Across the ancient world, people played games involving boards, counters, dice, and strategy. Dice themselves are extremely old, very old. Humans seem to have discovered the concept of throwing small objects and seeing what happens surprisingly early. Eventually, this developed into games of chance. And once people discovered gambling, they naturally discovered arguments about gambling, because apparently some human traditions are eternal. Someone loses. Someone insists the dice were unfair. Someone else says they were not unfair. Someone else starts giving unsolicited advice, and the evening continues. The Roman audiences also had plenty of ways to spend their free time. Roman society was filled with public entertainment. There were baths, markets, festivals, theaters, races, public performances, and various spectacles that could draw enormous crowds. The Roman bathhouse was especially important. A bath was not simply a place where you went in, washed yourself, and immediately left. That would have been far too efficient. Roman baths could function as social centers. People could exercise, talk, relax, eat, meet friends, conduct business, and presumably hear the latest gossip. For ordinary Romans, simply being around other people could be entertainment. And this is something we sometimes forget when thinking about the ancient world. We tend to imagine everyone sitting alone in a dark room staring at a candle. But people were social, very social. A village street could be noisy. A marketplace could be crowded. A public square could be full of conversations. A festival could bring together people who rarely saw one another. Entertainment was often something you participated in rather than something you consumed passively. You did not watch somebody else's vacation video. You went somewhere. You talked. You sang. You played. You watched. You joined in. And music was everywhere. Long before recorded music existed, people had voices. They also had drums, flutes, lyres, horns, bells, and other instruments. Music could accompany religious ceremonies. It could accompany dancing. It could be used at feasts. It could be performed by professionals. Or it could simply be someone singing because they knew a song. Songs were particularly useful because, like stories, they could be remembered. A melody could cross generations, and sometimes the words changed along the way. Again, humanity's unofficial editing department was memory. In medieval Europe, storytelling remained an important form of entertainment. For most ordinary people, books were still not everyday objects. Manuscripts had to be copied by hand. That took time. Writing materials cost money. Books could be beautifully decorated, and wealthy institutions might own collections of them. But a peasant family was not generally sitting beside the fireplace with a personal library of 50 novels. That would have been an unusually expensive peasant hobby. Instead, people heard stories from other people. They heard legends, religious stories, local traditions, folk tales, historical memories, songs, and jokes. Lots of jokes. People in the Middle Ages were not humorless creatures who wandered around wearing brown clothes and worrying about the weather. They laughed. They teased one another. They made rude jokes. They complained about neighbors. They enjoyed festivals. And they found ways to make ordinary life less monotonous. Traveling performers could be particularly entertaining. Depending on the period and region, entertainers might include musicians, singers, storytellers, jugglers, acrobats, or other performers. Some traveled from place to place. Others performed at courts or wealthy households. A traveling performer arriving in town could bring news, stories, music, and novelty. And novelty mattered. Imagine living in a small village where the most of the people you see every day are the same people. You know their families. You know their habits. You know which neighbor has a particularly loud rooster. You know which person is always late. You know who borrowed something 3 years ago and has mysteriously never returned it. Then a traveler arrives. Suddenly, there is something new. A new accent, a new story, a new song, a new rumor from another town. That alone could make an evening interesting. And then there were festivals. Festivals were among the great entertainment events of pre-modern life. Religious calendars created numerous occasions for gatherings. People could decorate their surroundings, prepare special foods, dance, sing, watch performances, and spend time with friends and relatives. For many people, these events broke up the routine of agricultural life, because daily life could be physically demanding. Work began early. There were crops to tend, animals to care for, food to prepare, clothes to repair, children to raise, tools to maintain. There was no washing machine waiting quietly in the corner. There was no refrigerator. There was no supermarket. And there certainly was no delivery app bringing noodles to your door because you suddenly decided you were too tired to cook. So, when people had free time, they often valued it. And one of the simplest forms of entertainment was conversation. People talked. They talked while working. They talked while eating. They talked while traveling. They talked while sitting around fires. They talked about marriages, births, deaths, weather, crops, politics, religion, neighbors, animals, and anything else that happened to be available. Gossip was not invented by social media. Social media simply gave gossip a faster delivery system. The basic human desire to know what everyone else was doing is much older. In medieval towns, inns and taverns could become social gathering places. People ate and drank. Travelers exchanged stories. Local residents heard news. Merchants discussed business. And somebody inevitably had an opinion about something, possibly everything. Games could also be played in these settings. Simple games required very little equipment. Cards became popular in parts of Europe later in the medieval period, after their introduction from Asia through complex networks of trade and cultural exchange. Before cards became widespread, people had many other games. Chess arrived in Europe from earlier traditions that developed in South Asia and traveled through the Islamic world. By the medieval period, chess had become known in Europe. The rules were not exactly the same as modern chess. The queen, for example, was originally much less powerful. Then, in the late medieval period, her abilities changed dramatically, and suddenly the queen became terrifyingly mobile. A rather appropriate development for medieval politics. Meanwhile, ordinary people could play simpler games that required nothing more complicated than stones, sticks, bones, or marked pieces. Children could invent games with almost anything. They could race, hide, throw objects, chase one another, play with animals, make toys. And adults were not necessarily above doing similar things. There was also sport, wrestling, archery, running, horse riding, stick fighting, ball games. Different cultures developed their own traditions. Some were connected to military training, others were simply fun. And sometimes the distinction was rather blurry. If you spent your afternoon practicing archery because it was useful in defending yourself, that was practical. If you spent your afternoon practicing archery because you enjoyed hitting things with arrows, that was also understandable. Humans have always been very good at turning practical activities into competitions. Who can run fastest? Who can throw farthest? Who can ride best? Who can hit the target? Who can lift the heaviest object? Who can win? And, perhaps most importantly, who can loudly explain why they would have won if they had not been unfairly distracted? So, as we settle deeper into tonight's story, it is worth remembering something. The absence of books did not mean the absence of culture. It did not mean people were bored all the time. And it certainly did not mean people were intellectually empty. Their entertainment simply depended more heavily on human interaction. Stories lived in voices. Songs lived in memories. Games lived in communities. News traveled through travelers. And evenings were filled by people talking to other people. Sometimes those conversations probably contained wisdom. Sometimes they contained useful information. And sometimes they were probably just two people arguing about whose goat had eaten whose vegetables, which really is not so different from modern entertainment after all. So, let us slowly leave the noisy marketplace behind. The lamps are beginning to burn lower. The musicians are packing away their instruments. The storyteller has reached the end of the tale. And somewhere nearby, somebody is still insisting that the dice were unfair. Of course they were. Or at least that is what he says. And tomorrow, when the sun comes up, there will be another long day of work. But tonight, for a little while, people can sit together, talk, listen, laugh quietly, and simply enjoy being around one another. Long before books became common, that was often enough. By now, we have established that people did not suddenly become bored just because books were expensive. Quite the opposite. They had developed an impressive collection of ways to spend an evening without needing to read a single page. And perhaps the most important of those activities was storytelling. Because before books became common, stories were not really objects, they were events. A story existed when somebody told it, and then, when everyone went home, the story disappeared back into memory, at least until somebody told it again. This made storytellers surprisingly important people. A good storyteller could hold the attention of an entire room. They did not need elaborate equipment. They did not need costumes. They did not need a microphone. They simply needed a voice, a memory, and preferably a story that did not become boring halfway through. That last part was probably more difficult than it sounds. Imagine sitting around a fire after sunset. There is no television, there is no internet, there is no newspaper, there is no book sitting beside you. The fire is crackling, the animals are settling down. Someone has finished eating, and then an older person begins talking. Perhaps they tell a story about a famous warrior, perhaps about an ancestor, perhaps about a clever animal, perhaps about a king who made a terrible decision. And, naturally, Everyone in the story is much more dramatic than anyone you know personally. The storyteller might change their voice for different characters. They might pause. They might repeat certain phrases. They might use gestures. They might exaggerate. And the audience would participate too. Someone might interrupt. Someone might correct a detail. Someone else might say they had heard a completely different version. Which is where things get interesting. Because oral storytelling was flexible. There was no single official copy. A story could change as it moved from place to place. One village might have a clever fox. Another might have a clever jackal. One version might end happily. Another might end with everyone learning a valuable lesson. And another simply might end because the storyteller forgot what happened next. We should not underestimate how entertaining this could be. Modern people sometimes imagine ancient storytelling as a solemn activity. But storytelling could be funny. It could be ridiculous. It could be rude. It could be exaggerated. It could include jokes about local people. And because the audience knew one another, those jokes could become very personal. Imagine a storyteller saying, "And then the farmer realized that his neighbor had been secretly taking his apples." Everyone in the room immediately looks at one particular neighbor. The neighbor says nothing, which, unfortunately, makes him look even more suspicious. This was also how history itself could be remembered. Before widespread literacy, communities depended heavily on memory. Genealogies could be memorized. Religious traditions could be transmitted orally. Important events could become part of local memory. Poems could preserve stories about rulers and heroes. In some cultures, professional poets and bards became extremely skilled at memorizing enormous amounts of material. They might perform long poems from memory. Some of these works could take hours to recite. And this brings us to one of the most remarkable forms of pre-book entertainment: epic poetry. Today, if someone told us they were going to recite a several-hour poem, we might politely check the nearest exit. But in the ancient and medieval world, long poetic performances could be major entertainment. The Greek tradition gives us the famous epics associated with Homer. The Iliad and the Odyssey belonged to a much older oral tradition before they were eventually written down. The stories contained heroes, gods, monsters, journeys, arguments, marriages, betrayals, and enough complicated family relationships to make a modern soap opera look surprisingly organized. The audience already knew many of the characters. That was part of the fun. It was not necessarily about discovering what happened. It was about hearing the story performed. A skilled performer could use rhythm and repeated phrases to help remember the material. Poetry was not simply decoration. It was a memory technology. Rhythm makes information easier to remember. Repetition helps. Formulaic phrases help. And if you are trying to remember thousands of lines without a printed script, every little advantage matters. So while modern people often think of poetry as something written quietly on paper, for much of history, poetry was something you heard. It was performed. It was social. It could fill a room, and sometimes it could fill an entire evening. Let's float over to another kind of entertainment: music. Music probably accompanied human gatherings for as long as people have had instruments. The earliest instruments we know about include simple flutes made from bone. There were drums, rattles, horns, stringed instruments, and countless instruments made from materials that simply did not survive archaeologically, because wood has the unfortunate habit of disappearing over thousands of years. Stone is much better at keeping secrets. Music could accompany work. It could accompany ceremonies. It could accompany dancing. It could accompany feasts, court ceremonies, or simply gatherings. People could dance in groups, in pairs, in circles, or in more organized performances. And unlike a book, dance required no literacy at all. You watched someone else. You copied them. Eventually, you learned. Then you taught somebody younger. That was how traditions survived. The same was true of songs. A child could hear a song from a parent. Years later, that child could sing it to their own children, and the song could continue long after the original singer had disappeared. This created a strange kind of cultural immortality. You could die, your voice could disappear, but the song might continue. And perhaps that is one reason music appears so consistently throughout human history. It carries memory remarkably well. Now, not everyone was sitting around listening to epic poetry. Sometimes people wanted something much simpler. They wanted games. And humans have been astonishingly inventive about games. Children could play with almost anything. Stones could become counters. Sticks could become imaginary weapons. A ball could be made from leather, cloth, animal hair, or other available materials. Even simple games of chasing and hiding required nothing. Hide and seek in various forms is not a modern invention. Neither are races. Neither are contests of strength. Neither is throwing something farther than your friend. Children do not require a detailed entertainment infrastructure. Give them an empty space and 20 minutes, they will invent something. Usually something adults immediately regret. Adults also played games. Board games were especially popular in many ancient societies. In Mesopotamia, the royal game of Ur is one of the most famous examples. A beautifully decorated board game dating to roughly the 3rd millennium BCE was discovered at the ancient city of Ur. We know the game involved pieces moving across a board. We have some evidence about the rules, but like many ancient games, we do not possess every detail with complete certainty, which is frustrating. Imagine finding an ancient game and then realizing the instruction manual is missing. Somewhere, 4,000 years ago, somebody apparently decided that future historians did not deserve the rules. Very inconsiderate. Ancient Egypt had Senet. The Romans played various board and dice games. The Greeks had games involving strategy and chance. And in many cultures, games could be played by both elites and ordinary people. There was also gambling. Humans have apparently been fascinated by probability since long before anyone understood probability. Dice could be thrown, lots could be drawn, and wagers could be placed. And suddenly, a perfectly peaceful evening became financially complicated. Gambling could be controversial. Authorities sometimes tried to restrict it. Religious leaders sometimes criticized it. Yet people continued doing it. Because if there is one thing history teaches us, it is that humans are remarkably committed to activities they have been repeatedly told to stop doing. Cards became particularly important later. Playing cards likely reached Europe during the 14th century, probably through contacts with the Islamic world, where card games were already known. Once cards arrived, they spread. They were portable, they were cheap enough to reproduce, and one deck could support many different games. That made them ideal entertainment. You could carry cards while traveling. You could play them in an inn. You could play them at home. You could play with friends. You could play for money. You could play for pride. Or you could play because everyone else was playing. And then there was chess. Chess has a fascinating journey. Its early ancestor developed in South Asia, probably around the 6th century CE, in a game commonly called chaturanga. From there, related forms traveled westward through the Islamic world. Eventually, chess reached Europe. The medieval European version was not quite the same as modern chess. The queen was initially much weaker. The bishop moved differently. The rules evolved, but the basic attraction remained. You were given a small army. You placed it on a board, and then you tried to defeat another person's small army while pretending that you were thinking several moves ahead. Sometimes you were. Sometimes you absolutely were not. Chess became particularly associated with educated and elite culture. But board games in general were not limited to intellectuals. People enjoyed simple games too. You did not need to be a philosopher to move a piece across a board. Sometimes you just needed an opponent who was willing to lose. And speaking of opponents, physical contests were another major source of entertainment. Wrestling was common in many ancient societies. So were races. Archery competitions existed. Horse races were popular. Athletic festivals could draw audiences. The ancient Greek Olympic Games are perhaps the most famous example. The original Olympic festival at Olympia was connected to the worship of Zeus. Athletes competed in various events: running, wrestling, boxing, chariot racing, and other contests. The games were religious, political, social, and athletic all at once. For spectators, they were entertainment, and for competitors, they were an opportunity to become famous. Of course, becoming famous in the ancient world was a little different from becoming famous today. There were no social media accounts, no interviews, no celebrity magazines. But a successful athlete could become well known. Poets could write about them. Their hometown could celebrate them. Their name could be remembered. And that mattered. Fame has always been one of humanity's favorite forms of currency. The Romans took public entertainment to another scale. Roman cities could have theaters, amphitheaters, circuses, bath complexes, and public festivals. The Circus Maximus in Rome was famous for chariot racing. Huge crowds could gather to watch teams compete. The atmosphere could become intense. People supported different factions. They argued, they celebrated, they complained, and naturally, they blamed somebody when their favorite team lost. The Roman world also had theatrical performances. Actors performed comedies and dramas. Mimes could entertain crowds. Musicians played. Jugglers and acrobats appeared. Street performers could attract audiences. Entertainment was not confined to private homes. It was built into urban life. The city itself could be a source of stimulation. And yet, despite all these impressive forms of entertainment, one of the simplest remained conversation. People sat together. They shared food. They told stories. They listened. They complained. They laughed. They discussed people who were not present, especially people who were not present, because gossip is remarkably portable across centuries. A medieval villager might say, "Did you hear what happened to the baker?" A Roman might say, "Did you hear what happened at the baths?" An 18th century aristocrat might say, "Did you hear what the Duke said?" And today we might say, "Did you see what they posted?" Different technology, same basic human curiosity. And perhaps that is the most comforting part of this whole journey. People in the past were not fundamentally different from us. They got bored. They became curious. They wanted company. They wanted stories. They wanted games. They wanted music. They wanted to laugh at someone else's foolishness without having to admit that they had done something equally foolish the previous afternoon. The main difference was simply the machinery available to them. There was no infinite stream of entertainment waiting in their pocket. Entertainment had to be created. Someone had to tell the story. Someone had to play the instrument. Someone had to organize the game. Someone had to bring the news. Someone had to start the conversation. And when the sun went down, the world became quieter. Perhaps a fire burned. Perhaps an oil lamp flickered. Perhaps people sat outside beneath the night sky. And slowly, very slowly, the evening passed. No autoplay. No notifications. No recommended videos. Just a story. Then another story. Then perhaps a song. Then somebody yawns. Someone else says they are tired. The storyteller finishes the sentence, and the room becomes quiet. For thousands of years, this was perfectly normal. And perhaps after all our modern inventions, there is something strangely peaceful about it. Because sometimes the oldest form of entertainment was simply having another person nearby. And that was enough. When the evening has settled in a little more, the fires are glowing, the streets are quieter. Somewhere, a dog is wandering around with absolutely no idea where it is going. And in a small settlement, long before anyone could open a book for entertainment, people are beginning to gather. Because one of the great secrets of pre-modern entertainment was that you did not necessarily need a special place for it. Sometimes the entire village was the entertainment. There were weddings, market days, religious festivals, seasonal celebrations, public arguments, and occasionally somebody doing something mildly ridiculous in front of everyone, which was basically free theater. A market day could be especially interesting. Imagine living in a small rural community. Most days you see the same people, the same houses, the same animals, the same fields, the same paths. Then, once in a while, traders arrive from somewhere else. They bring cloth, spices, tools, food, small objects, news, and most importantly, stories. Suddenly, the world becomes slightly larger. A merchant might have traveled for weeks. He might have passed through several towns. He might know what was happening in another region. Perhaps he had seen a large city. Perhaps he had visited a royal court. Perhaps he had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. But either way, people listened. Travelers were walking newspapers. Not particularly reliable newspapers, but newspapers with legs. And people were curious about distant places. What did another town look like? What did people eat there? Who ruled it? Were there strange customs? Was there a terrible storm? Had the price of grain changed? Was there a new war? Was the king ill? Did somebody's cousin really marry a nobleman? The answers traveled from mouth to mouth. And with every retelling, the story became just a little more interesting. Naturally, facts were occasionally given a little assistance. But entertainment was not always about information. Sometimes it was about spectacle. Public performances could attract large crowds. In medieval Europe, traveling entertainers could include minstrels, musicians, jugglers, acrobats, and storytellers. The talented performer could become useful to a powerful patron, and courts had their own entertainment culture. Royal courts might employ musicians, poets, jesters, actors, dancers, and storytellers. The medieval jester is particularly interesting. Modern popular culture often imagines a jester as someone whose only job was to make jokes while wearing a ridiculous hat. Reality was more complicated. Court jesters could entertain through jokes, songs, stories, music, physical comedy, and clever observations. Some were performers, some were musicians, some were poets, and some could occasionally say things that ordinary people could not. That made the position unusual. Imagine being employed by a king because you were one of the few people allowed to make fun of the king. It sounds like a wonderful job until you remember that the king is still the king. So perhaps you would want to choose your jokes carefully. Very carefully. There were also puppet performances and forms of popular theater. The exact traditions varied enormously from region to region, but the basic idea was simple. Give people characters, give those characters a problem, make them argue, and let the audience enjoy someone else's problems for a while. This formula has survived remarkably well. Modern television did not invent it. It merely added advertisements. Religious drama could also provide entertainment. In medieval Europe, mystery and miracle plays sometimes presented biblical stories to audiences. These could be performed in public settings. Scenes might be acted on temporary stages. People gathered to watch, and for communities where literacy was limited, visual storytelling was especially useful. A person did not need to read a theological text to understand a story being performed in front of them. The same basic principle appeared in many parts of the world. Pictures, sculptures, performances, songs, stories, rituals, all could communicate ideas without requiring a book. And then there were celebrations. Humans seem to have a deep need for occasions when ordinary rules become slightly more relaxed. Festivals could provide that. People dressed differently, food might be prepared differently, music became louder, dancing became more common, and work was, at least temporarily, pushed into the background. One famous example from medieval Europe was carnival. The traditions varied greatly by place and period, but carnival often involved feasting, masks, costumes, processions, music, and public festivities before the beginning of Lent. It could become wonderfully chaotic. People dressed up. Social roles could be playfully reversed. There could be jokes about authority, and everyone could enjoy being someone slightly different for a day. For a society with strict hierarchies, that temporary change could be refreshing. Of course, the next day, everyone would still know who owned the land. The king would still be king, the priest would still be the priest, and the baker would still expect payment. But for a little while, people could play. Other cultures had their own festivals and public celebrations. Ancient Greek festivals included theatrical performances. Roman religious festivals included games and processions. South Asian societies developed elaborate traditions of music, dance, drama, storytelling, and religious performance. Chinese festivals could involve lanterns, music, processions, games, and theatrical performances. Across Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas, communities developed countless local traditions. There was no single ancient entertainment system. There were thousands, and most of them were built around the same basic ingredients: people, time, space, and imagination. One particularly important entertainment activity was feasting. Food itself could become an event. A feast was not simply about consuming calories. It could involve music, stories, drinking, dancing, games, guests, and conversation. Among elites, feasts could become elaborate displays of wealth. A wealthy host could show everyone how much food they could afford, which is one of humanity's oldest ways of saying, "I have money." You could have expensive spices, rare meats, fine wine, beautiful dishes, musicians, decorations, and a long table full of people. The poor could not necessarily reproduce this scale, but communal meals existed at many levels of society, and eating together was entertainment in itself. Because eating gives people an excuse to sit down. Once everyone is sitting down, they start talking. Once they start talking, someone tells a story. Then someone remembers another story. And eventually, everyone has forgotten what the original conversation was about. This is another ancient tradition that remains remarkably healthy today. There was also humor. We should spend some time here because people in the past were funny, sometimes surprisingly funny. Ancient jokes survive in written sources. The oldest known joke collections include material from ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt. The Romans had jokes. The Greeks had jokes. Medieval people had jokes. They enjoyed wordplay, physical comedy, satire, insults, absurd stories, and jokes about bodily functions. Yes, those jokes are ancient too. Apparently, civilization can develop writing, architecture, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and sophisticated political systems, and then someone still laughs because another person made a noise at the wrong moment. Human consistency is beautiful. Ancient Roman graffiti provides another glimpse into everyday humor. People wrote messages on walls. Some were advertisements, some were political. Some were declarations of affection. Some were insults. Some were simply silly. The important thing is that people were not only communicating serious information. They were playing with language. They were leaving jokes behind. They were teasing one another. It is one of the reasons archaeology can feel strangely intimate. You can study a monumental temple built by a king, and then nearby you find some ancient person writing something incredibly petty on a wall. Suddenly, the past feels much more human. And this is why entertainment history matters. It shows us ordinary behavior. Kings leave official inscriptions. Governments leave laws. Religious institutions leave texts. But people also leave jokes, games, songs, graffiti, toys, and little objects they apparently enjoyed using. Children's toys are particularly revealing. Archaeologists have found ancient dolls, small animals, miniature carts, balls, spinning objects, figures, and other playthings. Children in the ancient world were still children. They wanted to play. They imitated adults. They created imaginary worlds. They carried toys around. They made games out of ordinary objects. A small wooden animal could become a horse. A stick could become a sword. A piece of cloth could become a doll. A stone could become anything. Children have never needed much equipment. They need imagination. And occasionally they need an adult to say, "Please stop throwing that." Adults, meanwhile, had more sophisticated ways of playing. One of them was sport. Horse racing was especially popular among elites. Owning and racing horses could be a display of wealth. It required training, animals, equipment, and money. But people loved watching competitions. The Romans were particularly enthusiastic about chariot racing. Different factions developed loyal supporters. The races could become major public events. Crowds shouted. Teams were celebrated. Drivers could become famous. And the whole thing became a form of mass entertainment. Interestingly, chariot racing was not simply something people watched occasionally. It could become part of identity. People supported their favorite factions. They argued about them. They celebrated victories. They complained about losses. They remembered famous competitors. In other words, sports fandom is not a modern invention either. Humans have been choosing sides and becoming emotionally invested in strangers who run around for entertainment for a very long time. And then there were public spectacles. These varied dramatically depending on culture and period. Some societies had wrestling competitions. Others had martial contests. Some had theatrical performances. Some had elaborate processions. Some had religious ceremonies that drew enormous crowds. The modern distinction between religion, entertainment, politics, and public life did not always exist in the same way. A festival could be religious, but it could also be social and entertaining. A royal procession could be political, but it was also spectacle. A public ceremony could communicate power, but people still watched because it was interesting. And interesting things are entertainment. Even executions historically attracted crowds in some societies, although this was a grim form of public spectacle rather than something we should romanticize. The broader point is that public life itself could be visually dramatic. There was no television, so the street was television. The square was television. The festival was television. The theater was television. The traveling performer was television. And perhaps most importantly, other people were television. You watched people. You listened to people. You guessed what they were thinking. You discussed what they had done. And then you told someone else. The entertainment cycle was complete. Eventually, though, the night became quiet. The market closed. The performers moved on. The festival ended. The musicians packed their instruments. The candles became shorter, the fire became smaller, and people went home. For some, the evening ended with a story. For others, perhaps a game, maybe a song, maybe conversation, maybe absolutely nothing. And that last possibility is worth considering, because not every moment in the past needed to be entertaining. Sometimes people simply sat. They watched the fire. They looked at the stars. They rested. They thought. They talked quietly. They slept. The modern world has created the strange idea that every empty minute should be filled. A notification, a video, a song, a message, a new article, a new picture, something, anything. But for most of human history, empty time was normal. Silence was normal. Boredom was normal. And people learned to live with it. Perhaps they even became comfortable with it. A person could sit outside after dinner and listen to insects. They could watch the moon. They could hear someone singing in another house. They could talk to a family member. And eventually, there was nothing else to do, so they went to sleep. No algorithm was waiting to recommend one more video. No autoplay button was quietly preparing another episode. The night simply ended, and tomorrow the same world would begin again.
The fields would still be there. The animals would still need feeding. The market would open. Someone would have a story. Someone would have a complaint. Someone would have a new rumor. And somewhere, eventually, another entertainer would arrive. Because before books became common, entertainment was not something people kept on a shelf. It was something they carried with them. In their voices, in their songs, in their games, in their memories, and sometimes simply in their ability to sit together and talk. And perhaps that is a comforting thought to fall asleep with. For thousands of years, people looked up at the same dark sky. They had fewer things to watch, but they still found something to do. Usually, they found each other.
The night has become quieter now. The market is gone. The performers have moved on. The last few conversations are fading into the darkness. And somewhere inside a small house, someone is probably still telling a story that has already been told several times before. Because that was another important feature of life before books became common. People repeated things a lot. The same songs, the same legends, the same jokes, the same family stories. And strangely enough, people did not seem to mind. In fact, repetition was part of the pleasure. If you already knew the story, you knew what was coming, and that could actually be comforting. You knew when the clever character would appear. You knew when the foolish character would make their mistake. You knew when the song would reach its familiar refrain, and you could simply relax and listen. Modern entertainment often depends on novelty. New episodes, new characters, new information, new surprises. But older forms of entertainment could be enjoyable precisely because they were familiar. A grandmother might tell the same story she had told 20 years earlier. Her grandchildren might already know the ending. They would still listen. Perhaps they would interrupt and say, "We know this part." And she would probably continue anyway, because of course she would. This was also how cultural traditions survived. A story that was repeated became a story that was remembered, and stories that were remembered could survive for generations. Before printing became widespread, memory was one of the most important storage systems available. It was not perfect. Human memory is never perfect, but people developed techniques for remembering. Rhythm, rhyme, repetition, melody, patterns. These made long passages easier to recall. This was especially important for professional performers. A poet who had to remember a long narrative could rely on repeated structures. A singer could use familiar melodies. A religious teacher could repeat phrases. An oral historian could memorize genealogies and important events. And sometimes these performances could last for hours. Imagine being invited to hear an epic poem. Someone stands up. They begin. You settle down. Half an hour passes. The story continues. Another hour passes. The story is still continuing. And nobody's asking whether there is a shorter version, because there isn't. You are committed now. There was also a practical reason for long performances. People had time. Not unlimited time, obviously. People still worked. But evenings could be long, especially during seasons when agricultural work slowed down. winter evenings could provide more time for indoor gatherings. And this was an excellent opportunity for storytelling, crafts, music, and games. In rural communities, people often worked while talking. That is another thing modern people sometimes overlook. Entertainment and work did not always exist as separate categories. Someone might be spinning thread while listening to a story. Someone might repair a tool while talking. People could prepare food together while singing. Women might gather for domestic work and exchange stories. Men might gather in workshops, inns, or communal spaces. Children moved around everyone. The result was a kind of background social life. There was always conversation, always noise, always somebody saying something. And that social environment itself could make life less monotonous. In some places, people gathered around communal fires. Fire was useful, obviously. It provided warmth. It helped with cooking. It provided light. But it also created a natural gathering point. After sunset, people were drawn toward the light. Someone sat down. Then another person joined. Then another. And before long, you had an audience. The fire became the center of the evening. And perhaps somebody started telling a story. Firelight also created atmosphere. A face illuminated from below looks slightly strange even today. Imagine seeing it when you have no electric lights. A storyteller could take advantage of that. A pause, a gesture, a change in voice. Suddenly, an ordinary story could feel mysterious. But we should not imagine that every evening involved dramatic tales about ghosts and monsters. Sometimes the story was simply about someone's neighbor. And honestly, those stories could be just as entertaining. Gossip was an ancient entertainment industry. Who was getting married? Who had argued with whom? Whose cow had escaped? Who had bought something expensive? Who was behaving strangely? Who had been seen talking to whom? Who had a new baby? Who owed money? Who was claiming something that everyone knew was not true? These were the kinds of questions that could keep a community occupied. And gossip served another purpose. It helped people understand their social world. Small communities depended heavily on reputation. People needed to know who could be trusted. Who was generous?
Who was difficult? Who was reliable? Who was dishonest? And because there were no online reviews, people relied on one another. You could not simply search for the best blacksmith in town. You asked your neighbor, and your neighbor would probably have a very strong opinion. Perhaps too strong, but useful nonetheless. Then there were riddles. Riddles were ancient. They required no equipment, just a question and someone trying to solve it. A riddle could be asked during a meal, around a fire, at a gathering, between friends. Children could use them. Adults could use them. And clever people could enjoy demonstrating that they were clever, which has always been one of humanity's favorite hobbies. Some ancient literary traditions contain riddles. The famous Old English poem Beowulf, for example, includes a large collection of riddles preserved in another manuscript known as the Exeter Book. These riddles describe ordinary objects in strange ways. The pleasure comes from trying to figure out what is being described. And again, you do not need a book to enjoy a riddle. You only need someone who knows it. One person asks, another thinks, someone guesses, Everyone waits. Then the answer comes. Sometimes everyone says, "Oh." And sometimes someone says, "I knew that." They did not, but that's fine. Another form of entertainment was mimicry. People imitated one another. They copied accents. They copied gestures. They made fun of local officials. They mocked pompous people. They exaggerated personalities. This could happen privately among friends or publicly through performers. Satire is ancient. People have always noticed that powerful people behave strangely, and people have always enjoyed pointing it out, even when they had to be careful. A clever joke could sometimes communicate criticism without directly making a serious accusation. A performer could make fun of a foolish character who suspiciously resembled a real official. Everyone understood. Nobody said anything, and the official probably pretended not to understand. This is another reason entertainers could occupy interesting positions in society. They lived close to the boundary between acceptable behavior and dangerous behavior. A musician could flatter a ruler. A poet could praise a king. A jester could make jokes. A playwright could criticize society through fictional characters. And audiences could enjoy the performance while understanding the deeper message. Entertainment was not always meaningless. Sometimes it was a way of discussing society safely. Sometimes it was a way of teaching. Sometimes it was a way of remembering. And sometimes it was simply a way to pass the time. There was also dancing. People danced at weddings, festivals, religious celebrations, seasonal events, feasts, community gatherings. Some dances were formal. Others were improvised. Some required skill. Others required little more than following everyone else. And dancing could involve entire groups. This created a sense of community. You were not sitting alone watching someone else dance. You were participating. And participation is important. Much of pre-modern entertainment was interactive. The audience could respond. The performer could adjust. People could sing along. They could clap. They could shout. They could laugh. They could interrupt. And they could even leave. There was no producer sitting backstage deciding whether audience retention had dropped by 3%. If people were bored, they simply walked away. A wonderfully simple analytics system. Of course, professional performers had to keep people interested. A traveling musician who was boring would probably not receive much money. A storyteller who forgot the interesting parts would not become particularly famous. An actor who could not project their voice in a crowded space had a problem. So entertainment professionals developed techniques, gestures, facial expressions, repetition, rhythm, costumes, props, music, timing. These techniques existed long before modern cinema. The technology changed. Human attention did not. People still wanted something that held them for a while. And then were puppets. Puppetry has extremely ancient roots. Simple figures could be made from wood, cloth, leather, or other materials. A performer could manipulate them. Stories could be acted out. Characters could become exaggerated. And puppetry had one major advantage. You could make an ordinary story feel visually different. A tiny puppet king could be ridiculous. A puppet animal could behave like a human. A puppet villain could be mocked. Children could watch. Adults could watch. And everyone could enjoy the strange little world created on a small stage. Street performances offered similar entertainment.
A crowd would gather. Someone would perform. Coins might be collected. Then the crowd would disappear. The performer would move somewhere else. It was a temporary theater. No building required, no ticketing system, no reservation. Just someone standing in a public space saying, "Watch this." And people did. This brings us to something that is easy to overlook. For most of history, entertainment was cheap because it was often made by people themselves. You did not need to purchase entertainment every evening. You could make it. You could sing, tell stories, play games, dance, talk, watch the stars, take a walk, visit neighbors, attend a festival, listen to travelers. That meant entertainment was woven into ordinary life. It was not necessarily separated from work, family, religion, or community. Modern life often divides everything into categories: work, school, entertainment, exercise, socializing. But older societies could be much more mixed. A wedding was a social event. A religious ceremony was a public event. A market was a commercial event and a social event. A feast was food and entertainment. A storytelling session could also be education. A song could be entertainment and historical memory. A game could be recreation and social bonding. The boundaries were blurry, and perhaps that made ordinary life feel more communal. There is also something peaceful about entertainment that ends. A story finishes, a song ends, a game is over, the performer leaves, the fire goes out, and there is no automatic replacement. No new episode starts, no new video appears, no notification arrives. Nothing is demanding your attention. Eventually, you simply become tired. And that might have been one of the great advantages of having less entertainment. People had more opportunities to become bored. And boredom, while unpleasant sometimes, can also lead to imagination. If nothing is provided for you, you have to make something yourself. A child with no television might invent a game. A group of friends might create a competition. Someone might write a song. Someone might tell a story. Someone might build a toy. Someone might simply stare into the fire and think. And then, slowly, the night would pass. The world would become quieter. The storyteller's voice would soften. The children would become sleepy. The adults would begin discussing tomorrow's work. The animals outside would settle down. And eventually, everyone would go to bed. Tomorrow would bring another day, another market, another conversation, another game, another story, and perhaps another rumor about the baker. Because some things, apparently, do not need books to survive. They only need people. So, as we drift further into this old world, we can leave the little village behind for a moment. The road is quiet now. The moon is above the fields. There is a faint light coming from a distant house. Someone is still awake. Perhaps they are telling a story. Perhaps they are singing softly. Or perhaps they are simply sitting in silence. And for once, nobody needs to press anything. The evening does not need to be optimized. It does not need to be productive. It does not need to provide endless entertainment. It simply needs to end. And eventually, it does. The village has gone quiet now.
The last voices from the street have faded. The cooking fires are mostly covered, and inside a small house, someone is still awake, perhaps sitting near a little lamp, doing something that people have done for thousands of years, playing a game. Because if books were rare, games certainly were not. And games are interesting because they reveal something very simple about human beings. We like rules. Not always, but when we are trying to have fun, apparently we enjoy creating a small artificial world where everyone agrees that certain things are allowed and certain things are not. Move this piece here, throw the dice, take the stone, run to the tree, do not step on that line, tag the other person. And if someone breaks the rules, everyone immediately becomes an expert in constitutional law. This happened thousands of years ago. Games were everywhere. Some were extremely simple, others were surprisingly complicated, and many of them could be played with objects that were already lying around. A few stones could become game pieces. A stick could become a marker. A piece of bone could become a token. A painted board could turn a table into an entire imaginary battlefield. This meant games could be enjoyed by people who had very little money. You did not need a large collection of possessions. You just needed something to play with. One of the oldest known board games comes from ancient Mesopotamia. The royal game of dates back roughly 4,500 years. Several game boards were discovered in the royal cemetery at They were beautifully decorated. Some were simple, others were elaborate. The game involved moving pieces across a board, apparently using some kind of chance mechanism. The exact rules have been reconstructed only partially, but we know enough to understand that people were playing organized games thousands of years before anyone was complaining about modern screen time. The board itself was an object of entertainment, and perhaps also a status symbol. A beautifully decorated game board could be expensive, which means somebody, somewhere, had the ancient equivalent of a luxury gaming setup. Except instead of glowing lights, it was probably made of wood, shell, and precious materials. The ancient Egyptians had their own famous game, senet. Senet boards have been discovered in tombs. Paintings show people playing. The game was popular for centuries. It eventually developed religious associations as well. But it probably began as entertainment. People sat down, they moved pieces, they tried to win. And somebody probably complained about bad luck. Again, some things are eternal. Dice were another major invention. The oldest dice-like objects go back thousands of years. They were made from different materials, including bone and other natural substances. The basic idea was beautifully simple. Throw something, see what number appears, and then let fate decide. Humans have always been fascinated by chance. The appeal is easy to understand. Strategy can be exhausting. Skill requires practice. But luck? Luck requires throwing something and then blaming the universe. Perfect. Dice games could be simple. They could also involve gambling. And gambling has existed for an extraordinarily long time. People could wager food, objects, money, or whatever else was considered valuable.
Authorities often disliked excessive gambling. Religious teachers sometimes criticized it. Yet people continued because humans apparently possess a stubborn little corner of the brain that whispers, "Maybe the next throw will be better?"
It usually has a very convincing voice. Board games could also involve strategy rather than pure chance. That brings us eventually to chess. The early ancestor of chess, Chaturanga, developed in South Asia around the 6th century. It represented different parts of an army: infantry, cavalry, elephants, chariots. The game then traveled westward, through Persia, through the Islamic world, and eventually into Europe. Over centuries, the rules changed. The medieval European game was different from modern chess. The queen was much less powerful. The bishop moved differently. Some pieces had different abilities. Then, around the late 15th century, major changes made the queen dramatically stronger. And suddenly, the most powerful piece on the board was the queen, which feels almost like the medieval game designers finally decided that queens had suffered enough. Chess became associated with intelligence, strategy, patience, and sometimes unbearable confidence. A person who was good at chess could become admired. But even among people who did not play sophisticated strategy games, simple games were everywhere. Children invented games. Adults invented games. Soldiers played games. Travelers played games. Prisoners played games. Monks played games. Kings played games. Everyone, apparently, needed something to do while waiting for something else to happen. Games were especially useful during travel. Imagine sitting in a wagon for several hours. The road is slow. The scenery is repetitive. There is no music streaming from your phone. No podcast. No audiobook. So someone pulls out a small board or some dice, and suddenly the journey has become slightly more interesting. The same thing happened in inns. Travelers could sit around a table, eat, drink, talk, play, exchange news, and argue about games. A tavern was therefore more than a place to consume beverages. It was a social center. People met there. Travelers brought stories. Locals brought gossip. Games filled the empty spaces between conversations, and occasionally someone lost money, which was perhaps less relaxing, but historically very common. Then there were physical games. Children could race. Adults could compete in wrestling. People could throw objects. Archery contests could be organized. Horse races could draw crowds, and ball games developed in many different cultures. Some ancient cultures had games involving balls made of leather or other materials. The rules were different from modern football, cricket, basketball, or baseball, but the basic instinct was the same. Take an object, create a goal, try to get it there, try to stop the other person, then argue about whether the point counted. Humanity has had thousands of years to perfect this formula, and we still have not solved the argument about whether the ball was out. There were also games involving balance and coordination. Children could spin tops. Tops are ancient. Simple spinning toys have been found in archaeological contexts across different periods and regions. A top is a remarkably elegant toy. You wind it, you release it, and it spins. That's it. No batteries, no instructions, no subscription, just spinning.
and children could become surprisingly skilled at it. They could compete. Who could keep the top spinning longest? Who could make it perform a trick? Who could hit another top? Again, a complete entertainment system from almost nothing. Kites also became important in East Asia. The history of kites goes back many centuries, with early traditions particularly associated with China. Kites could have practical uses, but they also became recreational. Children and adults could fly them. They could compete. They could decorate them. They could simply watch them moving in the sky. There is something especially peaceful about that. You stand in an open field. The wind is strong. The kite rises, and you hold a string. That is the entire activity. Modern entertainment would probably try to add 3 buttons and an advertisement. The kite refuses. It just flies. Music, meanwhile, could turn almost any gathering into an event. People did not need concert halls. A skilled musician could perform in a courtyard, a home, a marketplace, a tavern, a temple, a royal court. In many societies, musicians became professionals. They learned instruments, they memorized songs, they traveled, they performed for patrons, and some became famous. The instruments themselves could be remarkably sophisticated. Ancient lyres, flutes, harp-like instruments, drums, lutes, horns, cymbals. Different cultures developed distinctive musical traditions. Some music was used for dancing, some for religious ceremonies, some for storytelling, and some simply because people liked hearing it. That last category is probably the most important. Music did not need a practical function. People enjoyed it. And this made music one of the safest forms of entertainment. You could sing while working. You could sing while traveling. You could sing during a feast. You could sing children to sleep. You could sing when you were sad. You could sing when you were happy. And you could sing even if nobody had asked you to. Which brings us to one of the great advantages of no recording technology. Nobody could replay your bad performance. Once the song was over, it was gone. This was probably very good news for everyone involved. Imagine a world without recorded music. If someone sings badly, the performance disappears. There is no embarrassing recording. No one uploads it. No one sends it to a group chat. The moment ends, and everyone moves on. There was also dancing. Dancing could be formal or spontaneous.